Helen Steward is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Leeds. In this RIP broadcast, she talks to Rory Madden from UCL about the nature of philosophy, her intellectual influences, and about humans and other animals.
So I'll begin by asking a very straightforward question, which is, what is philosophy?
Well, you say that's a straightforward question. I don't think that's very straightforward at all. Partly because there's so many different traditions within philosophy. There's the analytic tradition, there's the continental tradition, and then of course there are all sorts of other traditions of which we know little, the Eastern traditions and so on. So I think it's very difficult to say exactly what it is. I suppose there are questions which are found being considered in all of these various traditions, questions of ethics, questions about the ultimate nature of reality. So big general questions that are in various ways too general really to be the subject of any science, and perhaps not really suitable to be the subject of any science, as in the case of a subject like ethics, where there's a lot of normativity involved. I would say those are the things that characterise philosophy wherever it is found. But then, there are so many specific questions and problems that you find within particular traditions that probably there is little resonance in others. So I don't think it's an easy question at all. The question what philosophy is. I think the only way to find out is to do some, really. Gradually you work your way into a feel for what sort of thing constitutes a philosophical question or a philosophical approach to a question.
So you mentioned a number of philosophical traditions. Do you see yourself as belonging to a tradition?
Yeah, I do. I think I do belong to the analytic tradition. That's my education's very much been in the analytic tradition. But I try to be aware of the ways in which that might, as it were, limit my vision. I think the other traditions have a good deal to offer to analytic philosophers, and I think it behoves us to read in the other traditions and learn from them. Recently, for example, I've become very interested in the phenomenological tradition. So I've been reading people like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and people like that, which were certainly not part of my, philosophical education at Oxford. Right. Those philosophers were never mentioned. But their concerns relate very deeply to, the concerns that I've come to have from a perspective that comes right out of the analytic tradition. So right. I think it's important not to be blinkered. I got into philosophy completely by accident. I applied for PPE in Oxford because I thought, I hadn't done any of those three subjects, philosophy, politics or economics before, but I thought I would like politics and economics, and I thought they were important to the world and I wanted to find out about them. And philosophy was just this thing that came along with politics and economics, and I didn't know what it was. And so in preparation for my interview, I wandered about in the school library looking for philosophy books, of which I can tell you there weren't many. In fact, I think there may only have been the one that I in fact found, which was Descartes' Meditations. And so I read that, and I thought it was utterly fantastic. I loved it. I was just gobsmacked by the fact that, there was this guy there sitting in his chair thinking about what he really knew about what was out there in the world, and coming to this conclusion in the second meditation that, he was the only thing he could really be sure existed. Then it all got a bit complicated and confusing in the middle meditations, where you get
formal and objective reality.
Yes, all that stuff. Very confusing, and I didn't know what was going on. But it was the most marvellous piece of work and complete revelation to me. So I think Descartes is part of the reason why I got into philosophy. But I think really what happened when I started studying PPE in Oxford was that I liked politics, I liked economics, they were fine. But the subject that I absolutely loved was philosophy. And I discovered, that people in that subject were thinking about, writing about all these questions that had been sort of vaguely going about in my head that I've been trying to think about in a very unstructured way by myself. And, there's this massive sense of discovery that there's this subject where people actually think in a structured, disciplined way about these questions and actually get somewhere with them, which I thought was marvellous. And the sad thing is, I suppose, that there's probably still people out there like me who don't know what philosophy is, who would really benefit from a philosophical education if they knew the subject was there to be done.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people just don't find it.
Yeah.
They just don't find it.
So you encountered certain books, so Descartes before you started, and then when you got to Oxford, you say you found these people writing about these fascinating issues, but were there particular personalities who you encountered who were inspiring, your peers or your teachers, or was that part of how you got into philosophy?
Well, yes. I mean, I encountered all kinds of inspiring people in Oxford. I mean, I had my first undergraduate teacher was Martha Klein, she's a philosopher who was very interested, as I have become, in the free will problem and had written about it. And she was a gentle, supportive teacher, and you really felt as though you could say whatever it was that had occurred to you, in answer to the question you'd been thinking about, and it would be fine to say it, and she would give you a thoughtful and supportive response, whatever it was. And so she was a very important first teacher for me. My main teacher, though, at St Hilda's was Jean Austen, who was the wife of J.L. Austen.
Oh, really?
A very famous analytic philosopher, who really, I suppose, was the founding father in some ways of the Oxford ordinary language tradition, of which Jean was also an aficionado, and of which I therefore became an aficionado in the end, temporarily. Jean was wonderful in her own way. I mean, she was rather terrifying. She was rather terrifying. If you said, silly things, she had no patience with you whatsoever. But she had a way of saying things and asking questions that opened things up for you. I remember her asking me a question about her fireplace and which parts of the fireplace were parts of the fireplace, in order to sort of get me to understand the point she was making about how concepts carved the world. And she was good at that. She was good at making things make sense with powerful examples. So she was great. And then I also had Cathy Wilkes, who was my other undergraduate tutor at St Hilda's, who was a marvellous person. She was a very strange person as well. I mean, I'd never met and never have met anyone either like Jean or like Cathy ever anywhere. Cathy was incredibly warm, funny, humorous, also incredibly supportive and willing to, think with you through the dreadful travesty that you'd produced as an essay, and she would help you, figure out what might be wrong with it, where you might have done better. She's dead now, very sadly. So that's a real loss to philosophy as far as I'm concerned. She was a great tutor.
That was your undergraduate education, PP in philosophy. Was it by the end of that degree sort of obvious that you wanted to go on to do?
Yeah,
do more?
I knew I wanted to do philosophy, and I applied for this thing called the B.Phil, and I knew it was very competitive, and I didn't really know if I was any good. I had no sense, because you have to apply before finals. It's a funny thing about Oxford is that you don't really get assessed much in a numerical way. You know, your tutor sort of makes qualitative comments on your essays, but I had no idea if I was any good. I mean, I asked, obviously, I talked to Jean and Kathy both about whether to apply or not, and Kathy said, oh yes, go for it. Jean was not encouraging, but I think it was because she thought that doing philosophy at graduate level was really a sort of rather vulgar thing to do.
Right.
And I remember her saying to me that, you know, I could always read Wittgenstein in the bath, she said. So, yeah, she tried to put me off, unsuccessfully. Yeah. The thing that I've most worked on is the thing that has always interested me the most, which is, broadly speaking, the problem of free will and the problem of mental causation. Those areas, kind of, how is it possible for us to be physical beings of the sort we are, and yet we seem to have these powers that are very difficult to understand and explain from a purely physical view.
Yeah.
It's just very difficult to make sense of the sorts of beings we are, and that's still the thing I'm most interested in. It probably always will be.
And in your writing and thinking on that sort of topic, are there particular influences on you, other writers?
Gosh, what has been the most influential on me? I mean, there are, as it were, classic philosophers. Aristotle has been a big influence. And he's another philosopher I didn't find until late. I didn't find Aristotle until I went to Berkeley. I had a year in Berkeley, out in the middle of my DPhil in Oxford. I went as a visiting student to Berkeley, and I did 2 courses on Aristotle, one on the ethics with Chris Korsgaard, who I was very lucky, she was there visiting at that time, and another one on the metaphysics with Alan Code. And I loved Aristotle, and I realised that his view of the human being was one that had sort of been lost from modern philosophy in a way. People had stopped thinking in those sorts of ways, you know, in terms of substances and powers, and capacities and skills, and it struck me that in Aristotle and in Aristotelian metaphysics there were all these ways of understanding animals, really, of which of course we are one species, that had been sort of lost post-Hume, I think.
Yes.
And needed to be reclaimed. So Aristotle's definitely one big influence.
So when you have students ask you whether they should go on into philosophy in a sort of serious postgraduate way, how do you handle that sort of question?
One could, I suppose, be a bit Jane Austen about it, and tell them how hard it is to get a job in philosophy and so on and so forth. It is, of course. But I tend not to do that, actually, because I think the motivation that people mainly have for going on to do graduate work in philosophy isn't to get a job in it. It's, you know, they're interested in the questions, they want a chance to think about them some more, and you can do that by being a graduate student in philosophy. And if it doesn't lead to a job in philosophy in the end, so be it. There are plenty of other jobs in the world that you can do, and you may do them better for having done philosophy as well. So I think I'm mostly just encouraging, provided I think that the person will get something out of it. Yeah.
And at the sort of undergraduate level, what do you think a student can get out of studying philosophy at undergraduate level?
Oh, well, all sorts of things. again, it depends a bit on their predispositions, but I suppose what I hope is that in teaching people philosophy, we're turning out better thinkers, more rigorous thinkers, people who are more easily able to spot when the wool's being pulled over their eyes in various ways, when they're being fobbed off with lies, damned lies and statistics, who will bring a more independent sort of mind to the things they read in general. And I hope to inculcate in students a capacity to question assumptions, really, that they might not have questioned before. To think, yeah, well, you know, I say that, but I don't really know that, or I haven't really got any reason for thinking that, or there's this other way you might think about it. You know, to give people just more lively minds in general. I mean, I think that's what philosophy should hope to do for undergraduates. It's very important to society that people have lively minds in all kinds of ways. You don't want to be living amidst a citizenry where people aren't inclined to think for themselves. So I think philosophy is tremendously important.
Yeah. I understand at the moment you're involved in a project where there's a collaboration with a zoo. Is this right?
Yes, it's a collaboration with Chester Zoo. So I have a project which the AHRC is funding called Persons as Animals. So the idea is to think about human beings from what I think of as a sort of animalistic perspective. But I don't mean by that, I mean, I think there's a tendency for people to suppose that thinking of ourselves as animals means thinking of ourselves in a very reductive way. So thinking of ourselves as, you know, engaged in relationships of dominance and subordination and, you know, rivalries of the sort that, you know, biological programs report on in the animal kingdom. I don't mean it like that at all. But I do think that philosophy of mind has been dominated by models of what human beings are that are deeply mistaken and which ignore the integratedness of human beings. The fact that they really are whole animals. They aren't, you know, they aren't souls and bodies, they aren't brains and bodies, they aren't software, you know, they aren't any of these things. What they really are is animals of a certain special kind. And I think we mistake our nature if that isn't to the fore, you know, as hence Aristotle again, in the Aristotelian picture. So part of the project is in conjunction with Chester Zoo. The work that we're doing at the zoo is with zoo visitors. We're doing focus groups with zoo visitors, which have two purposes. One is for the intellectual purposes of the project, to try to find something out about how zoo visitors tend to think of themselves, whether they think of themselves as part of the animal kingdom in any sense, and whether their visits to the zoo make any difference to that, whether, you know, seeing animals in certain contexts makes people reflect. I think it does make people reflect on where they fit in. And the zoo also wants to find out about a new project that it has initiated. It has a big new exhibit, a huge exhibit called Islands, where the style of the exhibit is very non-traditional. So people walk through, or in fact go through on a boat, an environment that's designed to be as natural as possible, just like the Southeast Asian islands that the Islands project is supposed to be representing. And the animals are, as it were, just there in the environment. You walk through them, you're one of them. So it's not like a traditional exhibit where there's some glass or bars or something and you're one side, the animal's the other side. You're in there, you're much more immersed. And so the zoo is interested in finding out whether people react differently to an exhibit of that sort as compared with the more traditional kind. So we're asking questions to find out about that as well. My big discovery of the last, 10 years is bird watching. That's what I do. I go out with my binoculars and I look at birds,
Okay.
which are beautiful and wonderful and tuneful. And it's one of those realms of knowledge that, you know, expands. The
Yeah.
more you know, the more there is to know.
Yeah.
And yeah, I love it. That's my top hobby at the moment.
Okay. Animal
Yeah.
watching.
Yes, I
Yes.
suppose it is. Yeah, a type of animal watching.